So what I have here is one of the books in my collection of books, grammars, books about language. This is was published in December 1st, 1976. If I recall, I just looked it up. This was previously owned by the linguistics department of the university that I went to. I got it at a used bookstore, so I'm not sure how it ended up there, but yeah, I have some problems with this book. This is A Grammar of Vi by W.M.E. Welmers. He, at the beginning, he talks about having some experience with some other languages. Uh, the author's prior experience with Mondakan and with the southwestern Mande languages, especially Kapele, and concurrent work on Manya made it far easier than it would otherwise have been to identify grammatical categories and constructions in Vi. Now, I'm going to be criticizing this, but to be fair, the next sentence, at the same time, of course, it would be presumptuous to claim that the data included in this study are completely free from error, or that the analysis is exhaustive or incapable of refinement. So, they're aware they're not perfect. I assume it's a man. I don't. Anyway, when I when I first look at this, I don't know how long I've had this, maybe 10 years, something like that. When I first look at this, Vi is a tonal language. There's a chapter on tone. Well, this is actually it's pretty much all about questions. How when you ask a question, it changes the tone of the sentence, and this is actually it works very much like English does, right? So, where are you going? Right, you have a rising tone at the end, or what is that? It's kind of a falling tone with that sort of. The problem that I have here, all throughout this book. Okay, so immediately two problems. All throughout this book, this author is very aggressively attempting to push what they're calling a practical orthography, or a practical writing system. And, it seems nice. We're trying to help these people become literate in their own language. That sounds cool. The problem with this is, let's see, this is 76, so for about 140 plus years, 140 to 150, I'm not quite sure the exact date, Vi has had at the time of this publication, Vi had its own writing system. Vi had its own writing system, invented by its own people. And through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, literacy among the Vi in this writing system was high. This practical orthography that is being pushed in, just the concept of a practical orthography in a Latin-based alphabet. In this context, I take issue with that. No, you should be promoting that indigenous, like, if you're promoting the indigenous culture, if that's the reason that you want to be pushing for anything with this language, right? I mean, it's a relatively good grammar. It's a terrible dictionary. It's another problem I'll get into in a second. But it's relatively good grammar. So I imagine the reason you're doing this work is to help educate people in this language, make it more widespread, because it is traditional culture belonging to these people, and you want to honor that. But they have, part of this culture is they have their own writing system, and you're just walking in being like, nah, Latin alphabet's better. What? And then further, so this is actually the thing that kind of pissed me off the first time I even looked at this, because I didn't know when I first read this that Vi had its own writing system. I found out like 10 minutes later. Just like, I just picked it up because it's a grammar of a language. And then I took it home and looked at it and was like, wait, I recognize some of these words. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm just going to read part of this. The tones of Vi, as described above, so that would have been a previous chapter, because I'm literally reading the first sentence, so there's nothing above this. I kind of find that's a weird way to write, because you know that it's chapter 4, and it's on its own page, whatever. Are heard in isolated words and phrases, and without appreciable difference in complete declarative sentences and in question word questions. So basically what he's saying is the tone in Vi, the tone on the words, doesn't change, at least doesn't change very much, between statements and questions that, they're like WH questions in English, like who, what, where, when, why, those sorts of questions. Okay, that's fine. And then he goes into some detail. Let's see. And then a few sentences down, it's still in that first paragraph. For purposes of a practical orthography, read that as an imposed Latin-based orthography on these people who already have an indigenous writing system that works just fine for the language. For purposes of a practical orthography, it is strongly recommended that a period, rather than a question mark, be used at the end of an utterance containing a question word and expecting an answer. What? What? And then, in the examples, he has Vi questions over here with English questions over here. The English questions have question marks because they're questions. And a question mark marks a question. And over here, the same exact thing in Vi, marked with a period. Even though they're questions. Questions. Why wouldn't you mark questions with a question mark? Because the tone doesn't change? And in English, when you have a question mark, the tone changes? That's your reasoning? Are you serious? This is a professional linguist. He's worked on other languages. I assume... Yeah, yeah, it doesn't talk about their education, but I assume educated, somehow getting funding from somewhere, from the University of California, I think, to go out and do fieldwork in these languages and report on it and publish your findings. But this person does not understand that a question mark marks a question. It's in the name. Question mark. Okay, well, the next part. Questions which may be answered with assent or dissent, so yes or no, are marked by a question intonation which affects only the final tone of the utterance. Blah, blah, blah. Basically, the conclusion is because here the tone acts like English, question intonation may be indicated by a question mark. It should be noted that this is intended to mark only a phonologic intonation, not every logical question. So these are questions like the examples are, is he there? Is he coming? Didn't they come? So these are yes-no questions. And we can use a question mark. Ooh, where's the camera? We can use a question mark on these ones, but not on these ones, the WH sort of questions. On the yes-no questions, we can use a question mark. Because the final intonation acts kind of like how English works. That is literally this dude's thinking as a professional linguist who has worked in multiple other languages. Somebody has paid them to work on languages, and they don't understand what a question mark does. And the best part is the end of this sentence. Not every logical question. When you're writing that should give you pause and be like, wait, I fucked up. Question mark should mark all the logical questions. And what we should do is we should go back and be like, okay, so if it's like a WH question, we know that the tones are going to do one thing. And if it's a yes-no question, we know the tones are going to do something else. This is actually how English works. So the fact that they're letting their sense of how it works in English interfere is actually stupid, even insofar as it goes, because this is what they think is happening in English isn't even what happens in English. Because when you ask a WH question in English, the tone does not rise. The question mark is not marking a rise in tone even there in English. Right? What is this? There's no rise in tone there. Is this mine? There's a rise in tone there. Is this mine? What is this? WH questions in English often end with a fall in tone. So it is ridiculous that a trained linguist would come in and say, oh, we should only use question marks where the tone rises. In a language that's not English, right? You're letting your sense of how English works interfere to a point, and it's a wrong sense of how English works. You're a trained linguist allowing a wrong sense of how English works interfere with your proposal for a practical orthography for a language that already has an indigenous orthography. Fuck you, dude. Well, and then it gets better. So I mentioned that it's really, oh God, it's tragic as far as being a dictionary. It does talk about the syntax quite a lot, and for all I know, all of that is immaculate. It could be perfect. I don't have any criticisms about that, because honestly, once I got to this, I kind of stopped ever looking at this book ever again. But yeah, the Vi they live in Liberia and like the border of Liberia and Sierra Leone, like that area. But they live inland, and they're primarily farmers, from what I've discovered. But a lot of the vocabulary, there's very little vocabulary given at all. But a lot of the vocabulary that is given is for things like sharks, crabs, like stuff from the beach. These people don't live on the beach. Why are you giving these words? Those are probably borrowed words from some other language that is actually on the coast. And it gets better than this because it is known or claimed by like an eyewitness, something like that. The history on this is kind of shady, but the guy who invented the writing system, the indigenous writing system for Vi, which is being supplanted here with the practical orthography. Jesus. The guy who did that, it's thought that he got inspiration by visiting the coast. Which means they're not a coastal people. They live inland. So when like a third of the vocabulary that you're giving is for types of fish and sharks and turtles and what are you doing? What are you doing? Somebody paid you to do this research. Probably, God, I hope not, but probably this ended up playing into government programs because I do know that Vi is taught to non-Vi speakers in Liberia. That is a thing. So the government is involved in this, and they probably referenced this shit. Like, this probably played a role in making decisions. And this is horseshit. This is a pile of horseshit. Go science.